Hello guys, welcome to a new chapter of the Empress Dowager Cixi. This is going to be chapter 24, Flight, 1900-1901. Her hair twisted into a bun, and in an informal blue cotton gown that she often wore at home, Cixi began her flight in a mule cart. It was the height of summer, and the clothes she wore stuck to her wet body. Sweating animals under load attracted swarms of flies and insects. Soon it began to rain, and although she was not soaked like her unprotected entourage of about 1,000 people, who rode and trudged through the mud, the cart jerked violently, her this way and that. Later someone found a chair borne by two mules, one in front and one at the back, and she had a little more comfort, but the chair still swung around on the bumpy roads. Crossing a flooded river with no bridge, her guards lifted the bottom of her chair. The floods were swift and she was nearly swept away. She was fleeing to the west, into the interior. In front of her lay a wasteland of smoldering villages and towns, pillaged by the Boxers and by the shattered Imperial army. Hardly a door or a window was intact, and the walls were scarred by bullets. Not an inhabitant was in sight. She was desperately thirsty, but when the eunuchs went to draw water from a well, they found human heads floating in it, so she had to chew plant stems for their moisture. No matter how hungry she felt, there was no food, and there was no bed either. She and the Emperor sat throughout the second night on a bench, with their backs against each other, staring at the roof. Near dawn, a chill rose from the ground and seemed to penetrate her bones. Famously immune to the cold, the 64-year-old now found it hard to bear it, as she would later describe. On the first night, the Emperor slept in a mosque, on a prayer mat, with a rat and dustpan and a handler's broom wrapped in a grey chair cover as his pillow. In the morning, His Majesty rolled up his precious bedding into a bundle, which he clutched to his chest, not trusting it to the eunuchs. Many eunuchs lagged behind and sneaked away. They were used to long-distance walking on stone-strewn country roads in their cotton-soled shoes, which, soaked in mud, made every step agony for them. The Emperor, also holding on tight to his pure gold water pipe, was dressed in a thin silk gown and shivered uncontrollably once the sun set and the temperature plummeted. Liang Jin, the head eunuch, offered His Majesty his own padded jacket, which he presented on his knees, with tears streaming down his cheeks. Later, the Emperor would often say that without Liang Jin, he would not have survived the journey, and that he was forever grateful. Thereafter, he treated the eunuch as a friend. After 2 nightmarish days and nights, Cixi arrived at a town where the local chief was still in place to greet her. County Chief Yo Wong had received notification of their arrival on a piece of dirty, crumpled paper without an envelope. It gave a long list of the court that he was ordered to provide for, and provided for in style. In keeping with imperial pomp, a full banquet of Manchu and Han dishes, Man Han Quan Ji, was to be laid out for the Empress Dowager and the Emperor. After that, a great one feast was to be served to each of the 12 princes and grandees. The note said that the number of officials and servants was unknown, and that he should prepare as much food and horse feed as possible. This was a tall order in a county town that had been emptied by the Boxers and soldiers. County Chief Wo's staff had advised him to ignore the piece of paper and to pretend not to have received it, or just to get out of the place, like other officials on the royal route. But Wo was a loyal and kind-hearted subject, so rather than dismissing the demands as ludicrous, he fretted about how to best fulfill them. County Chief Wo's best was pitiful. His cook had gathered some food but was robbed on his way to the kitchen by soldiers from the retreating army, who simply grabbed the donkey and carried it away. When the cook resisted, he was slashed on the right arm. He eventually succeeded in making 3 woks of mung bean and millet gruel, but 2 were wolfed down by starving soldiers who reluctantly left 1 for the royals. Wo placed sentries around the remaining wok, ready to open fire on anyone who came close. He then tidied up a room in a deserted inn for the Empress Dowager to rest in, managing to put cushions on the chairs and curtains on the doors, even painting on the walls and some ornaments on the tables. When she arrived and set eyes on his luxury and on the county chief prostrating himself on the floor, Cixi burst into tears. Between loud sobs, she told Wo that she had never thought things would become as bad as this. After describing the misery of their journey, she brightened up at the news of the mung bean and millet gruel, and was about to order it brought in when she suddenly remembered the Emperor and told Liang Jin to take the county chief to greet his majesty. Wo saw a shabby man, unshaven and unwashed, wearing an old padded jacket which hung loosely around him. Emperor Wangju did not say a word, and Wu withdrew to fetch the gruel. It then emerged that he had forgotten chopsticks, so Cixi told the servants to bring some Shogun stems. As Wu retreated outside the room, he heard their majesties sucking eagerly on the gruel. After a while, Liang Jin came out and gave an approving thumbs up, saying how pleased the Empress Dowager was. He also said that the old Buddha longed for an egg. Thereupon Wu searched the town, at last finding 5 eggs in an empty drawer inside an abandoned store. Having lit a fire and boiled the eggs himself, he served them in a coarse bowl with a few pinches of salt. Liang Jin carried them into Cixi, and on his return a few minutes later, smiled to Wu. The old Buddha loved them. She ate 3 and left 2 to the master of 10,000 years. No one else got to touch any. This is good news, but now the old Buddha would love to have a puff of her water pipe. Do you think you could find some spills? Wu improvised by rolling up some rough paper on the windowsill. Shortly afterwards, the Empress Dowager stepped out of the room onto the terrace, parting the curtain on the door himself, which was normally a job always done by servants. Lighting the pipe herself as well, she puffed at it and seemed to picture everything with a lot of content. Looking around her, she caught sight of Wu and began to speak to him, which obliged the county chief to go down on his knees in the muddy yard. She asked him if he could find some clothes for her. Wu said that his wife had died and her clothes were all in Beijing, but he had some clothes that his late mother had left behind. And if the Empress Dowager did not mind their coarseness, at this Cixi said, "Anything that can keep me warm. By the way, it would be just wonderful if you could also find some clothes for the Emperor and the princesses, who brought no changes either." Wu went home and opened his late mother's trunk. He found a wool coat for the Empress Dowager, a long waistcoat for the Emperor, and a few robes for the princesses. From his sister-in-law, he took a dressing table set, which had a mirror, a comb, and face powder. Wrapping everything into a large bundle, he delivered it to a eunuch. Later on, when the royals came out of their quarters, they were all dressed in his family's clothes. This was the first time Cixi was seen wearing Han Chinese attire. The imperial party stayed in County Chief's Wu for another 2 nights. Cixi learned from him that the Boxers had not only wrecked his county, but also came close to killing him during the time they occupied the town. On one occasion, they had seized him and told him they wanted to satisfy themselves that he was not a secondary Harry. The verdict, fortunately, was in his favor, hinged on whether the ashes from a piece of paper they burned up went up or down. On another occasion, a letter from him to a good friend in which he complained about the Boxers had been intercepted, and he only escaped retribution after vehemently denying it was his handwriting. On the most recent occasion, when he was actually trying to get out of the town in order to greet the royal company, the Boxers refused to open the gate, but snorted, "They are fleeing and don't deserve to be on the throne." But the mob feared approaching Praetorian guards after all and took to their heels. Disapproving though he was of her backing for the Boxers, County Chief Wu loyally found the Empress Dowager a sedan chair and another for Emperor Wangju. Cixi took Wu along with him, making him a manager for the onward journey. She told him, "You have done a very good job, and I am deeply grateful. I will not forget your loyalty and will show my gratitude. The Emperor and I appreciate how difficult it will for you to manage the logistics. We will not dream of being difficult or demanding. Please be at ease and don't have any misgivings." These words brought tears to Wu's eyes, and he took off his hat and touched his forehead on the floor. Then Cixi inquired gently, "That cook of yours, Su Fu, is really good. The noodles he just served are quite delicious, and the stir-fried shredded pork is very tasty. I'm thinking of taking him with me on the journey, but I wonder whether he will be willing." To this delicately put command, Wu naturally answered affirmatively on the cook's behalf, adding that it was his honor too. Having lost his cook, he had to eat at a friend's house that evening. The cook was promoted to the royal kitchen and was given an impressive title. Cixi had fled the capital and Western allies had occupied it. The Chinese defenses had disintegrated, and yet Cixi's rule did not collapse as most had anticipated. In flight and in a sorry state, she showed that she was still the supreme leader. Eyewitnesses seeing her climbing onto the mule cart said that she did so as if it were the imperial throne. From then on, wherever she was became the nerve center of the empire. The orders she sent to the provinces, using the same language and tone as always, conveyed absolute authority. Reports from all over China found their way to her. She asked for troops to escort the royal group, and the troops rushed over as fast as their horses could carry them. She asked for money, food, and transport, and this poured in quickly and abundantly. She was well provided for during the rest of the journey, which covered more than 1,000 kilometers and lasted for more than 2 months. In late October in western China, as she settled in the ancient city of Xi'an, capital of more than a dozen Chinese dynasties from 11 BC, she received more than 6 million taels from all over the empire. When the court returned to Beijing a year later, 2,000 carts were loaded with tributes as well as with paperwork. This miraculous display of loyalty in an unprecedented crisis spoke volumes for the general stability of the empire. Rooted in a deep faith in the Empress Dowager by the population, the grassroots leaders, and the provincial chiefs. A deep faith that overrode their recent disenchantment. That she was still alive and very much in command, stopping their tracks those who had thought of jumping ship. One straw in the wind concerned the fate of her bête noire, Sir Yin Huan. When she had ordered the governor of Xinjiang, where Xin Yuan was in exile, to execute him, the governor chose not to do so. He was hedging his bets. The invaders were marching on Beijing and Sir Yin Huan was their friend. The order was only carried out 50 days later, on August 20, when the governor learned that Cixi had left the capital and was safe. That she was evidently still at the helm and her government had not collapsed changed the mind of Viceroy Zhang, who abandoned his plan to set up a separate regime in Nanjing. The people he had envisaged joining him in his new government, who in fact had not been told about his plan, had affirmed their allegiance to Cixi. Li left Shanghai for Beijing to act as her negotiator, and when the British approached Viceroy Liu Kunyi, his closest colleague, telling him that London looked to him and Viceroy Zhang to take control and negotiate with the Allies, Liu was horrified. He cabled Viceroy Zhang and asked him whether he had received the same bizarre message. He also reminded Zhang that the man the British should be dealing with was Li, who took instructions from the Empress Dowager. So when Tokyo was still talking about setting up a new government, implying that there would be a key role for him, Viceroy Zhang flew into a panic and fired off a cable marked with an unusual 1,000 times urgent to his representative in Japan, telling him to stop this at once at all cost. He sent a follow-up the next day explaining that any such move would most definitely ignite eternal strife and throw the whole of China into warring chaos. Zhang proceeded to lobby Western powers to protect Cixi. Indeed, her safety had always been one of his priorities, even when he completed forming the new government. He and Viceroy Liu had told the British acting consul general in Shanghai, Bayham L. Warren, who reported to Lord Salisbury, that unless it is guaranteed that her person shall be protected, they will be unable to carry out the agreement of neutrality, which the viceroys had signed with the powers, promising to maintain peace and protect foreigners in their provinces. When he heard that Allied troops had entered Beijing, Viceroy Zhang repeated his request that Cixi must not suffer the slightest harm. And when he learned that Cixi had fled, he cabled the Chinese minister in London, asking him to see Lord Salisbury, and requested the same assurance once more. The unequivocal support for Cixi by the viceroys dashed Western hopes of pursuing and toppling her. Many had advocated replacing her with Emperor Wangju. Sir Claude MacDonald, the British minister, was one of them, but he was warned off by Lord Salisbury. There is great danger of a long and costly expedition which, at the end, will not succeed. The Prime Minister rejected the idea of a joint occupation of conquered territory. The attempt to undertake the maintenance of law order in northern China will be hopeless even if we stood alone. But as it is, it will produce a collision between ourselves and our allies, and it could end disastrously. No occupation will work without a high-ranking Chinese collaborator. but the powers realized that all the most senior Chinese ranged themselves solidly on the side of the Empress Dowager. They had thought that the empire was in the hands of the viceroys, who were furiously opposed to Cixi. But now, when the crunch came, they found that these men were still enthralled to her. Not one of them was willing to step forward to challenge her. It was all too clear that Cixi was the only person who could hold the empire together. Her demise would result in civil war, which for Westerners would mean especially the collapse of trade, the default of loans, and the emergence of more boxers. And so for these overwhelming reasons, the Allies decided not to pursue the Empress Dowager. On October 26, 1900, confident of her safety, Cixi took up residence in Xi'an. Her representatives, Prince Qing and Li, opened negotiations with the powers. Meanwhile, Viceroy Zhang, the only man in the regime who had contemplated replacing her and who had enlisted foreign powers' assistance, was anxious to explain himself to her. From the shots she had fired across his bows, he knew Cixi was conscious of his machinations, which could be deemed treason by many a monarch. Although she did not punish him, he reckoned she could not have been pleased. He wanted to explain to her in person that this had only been a contingency plan in the case of her government's demise, and he had never wanted to overthrow her. He wrote and asked for an audience, saying that he had not seen Her Majesty for well over a decade, and, filled with regret and a sense of guilt, he longed to come to a place on her route ahead of her to welcome Your Majesty on my knees. Cixi's reply was a curt "no need to come." Her displeasure was transparent. The viceroy then asked a close associate to intercede on his behalf when the man had an audience with Cixi. The viceroy had not seen Your Majesty for 18 years, said the man, and since Your Majesty's journey to the west, he has been so concerned and worried about Your Majesty and miss Your Majesty so much that he has been unable to eat or sleep properly. Dare I ask why Your Majesty declines to receive him? Cixi gave an excuse. He can leave his post at the moment as things have not quite settled down, and she promised to ask him to come to Beijing once we are back. But when eventually she returned to the capital at the beginning of 1902, she found another pretext and postponed the audience again. Another year later, the viceroy could not wait any longer and wrote to announce that he was coming to Beijing in the spring of 1903 anyway, as he would be free of duties then, and he just wanted to see Her Majesty, whom he had been missing for 20 years. This time he received a positive one-liner: "You may come for an audience." In May that year, Viceroy Zhang arrived in Beijing and at last had his meeting. According to the Grand Council Secretary who escorted him into the Summer Palace and the eunuchs outside the audience hall, he and Cixi said virtually nothing to each other. The moment he went in, she burst into tears, at which he too began to cry. She went on sobbing and did not ask him any questions, so Zhang was unable to talk. The audience protocol was for the official to speak only when the monarch addressed him, and Cixi gave Viceroy Zhang no chance to open his mouth. They sobbed for a while before Cixi told him to go and have a rest, upon which he withdrew. The silence was by design. For Cixi, what the Viceroy had done was best left unsaid. Spelling it out and trying to explain would only upset and alienate her. She had already decided to accept his action, which she judged to be of decent motive. She further demonstrated to Zhang that she held nothing against him by having delivered to him the next day a painting by her own hand, of a pine tree, symbol of uprightness, next to a plant, Cixi, to which a man of integrity and wisdom was often compared. The meaning was eloquent and the viceroy was relieved and overjoyed. Immediately putting pen to paper, he wrote, "Like a withered old tree touched by the most gracious winds, overnight the color of black returned to the great hair on my temples." Viceroy Zhang composed 15 similar poems of gratitude. They described his time with Empress Dowager and noted all her little tokens: dishes from her own table, fruits from her orchards, ravishing silks. One day, in her presence, some sweet melons grew in the palace grounds and they were brought to him. She pronounced that they were not beautiful enough, and servants were dispatched to town to search for better-looking melons. Another day he heard from an official that the Empress Dowager had compared him to a great historical figure who had been the pillar of his dynasty. These celestial words, as he wrote, sent the viceroy to a gratitude frenzy and made him more humbly devoted than ever. When he left Beijing, Cixi gave him various farewell presents, including 5,000 tiles of silver, which he used to start a modern school. When he reached home, 3 lots of gifts from her were already waiting for him. The viceroy was overcome and wrote another of his poems of gratitude. Thus Cixi conquered the hearts of her subjects and earned herself phenomenal loyalty. When she was fleeing Beijing in 1900, Junglu, another devotee, took it upon himself to lead an army in a different direction, aiming to lure away potential pursuers. Among the voluntary decoys was Chongji, the father of Cixi's late daughter-in-law. When the pursuers did not materialize and in despair that he was not able to do more to help, Chongji hung himself with the shafts of his robe, leaving behind a few poignant lines. I fear that I am powerless to be of any service to the throne. I only have my life to offer, and I hereby offer it. When the allies entered the capital, his wife and had 2 huge pits dug in their house and conducted the whole family, children included, to sit in them in an orderly manner before she told the servants to fill the pits with earth and bury them alive. When the servants refused and fled in horror, her son set the house on fire, killing all 13 of them. This was not an exceptional case. Scores of families committed suicide by setting their houses on fire, in addition to individuals drowning themselves. Cixi also had determined enemies who saw their chances in 1900. Wild Fox Khan set about raising an army and occupying a number of major cities with arms supplied by Japan. Many Japanese took part in this venture while he stayed overseas. An assassination squad was formed, comprising more than 30 sea pirates. Recruited from the south coast around Hong Kong, it was led by a Japanese, and was ready to go north with the twin objectives of assassinating Cixi and restoring Emperor Guangzhou. Hoping to persuade Britain and other powers to help them achieve this goal, the Wild Fox men wrote to Acting Consul General Paynham L. Warren in Shanghai, stating as Warren cabled to Lord Salisbury that unless the Emperor was restored to the throne, they were prepared to stir up the secret societies throughout the country with the object of compelling foreign powers to intervene. It was pointed out in this communication that grave injuries would be inflicted on foreign trade by popular risings, which they regarded as inevitable, and destruction of missionary property was to be anticipated. Clearly, this line of argument was unlikely to be persuasive, as it merely confirmed to the British that Kang's force was no better than the Boxers. Not surprisingly, Britain lent them no support. The Wild Fox had been dreaming of being collected, protected and conveyed to Beijing by a British gunboat. The dream was dashed. Instead, the powers fully backed Viceroy sank as he rounded up Kang's men who gathered in his territory. Wuhan, the moment their uprising began, Britain supported the Viceroy's execution of the main rebels, as the British representatives there reported to Warren. Peace of Jiangxi, otherwise secure, is in peril by Kang's group, the Reform Party, which is actively fomenting a rebellion. They out that they have our support. Arms and ammunition have been smuggled from Japan, and incendiary proclamations have been posted up everywhere. It is no longer a question of reform but of anarchy and pillage. There are many Japanese among confederates of Kang. Viceroy Sang's request that you will confer secretly with the Japanese Consul General to confirm the Japanese involvement. Tokyo reining the Japanese in Kang's camp. The demise of the Empress Dowager and external strife across China were not in Japan's interest at the time, when there were the armies of other powers on Chinese soil, all with territorial ambitions of their own. The Japanese leader of the assassination squad pulled out, claiming illness, and was replaced by a Chinese, Sheng Jin, but before it set off, Kang's rebellion had collapsed. Also hoping to take advantage of Cixi's troubles was one Sun Yat-sen, an early proponent of republicanism. A dark-moustached Cantonese who had long shed his Q and Chinese costume in favor of a European-style haircut and clothes, he was dedicated to overthrow the Qing dynasty by force. In 1895, in the aftermath of the disastrous war with Japan, he launched an armed uprising in Canton. It failed but made his name known to the court. He fled overseas, eventually to London, where he was seized by the Chinese and detained in their legation in Portland Place. The British government, which had refused to extradite him, intervened and secured his release. Later on in Japan, he sought a collaboration with Wild Fox Kang, but Kang refused to have anything to do with him. Undeterred, Song worked doggedly for his republican idea through armed insurrections and acquired a Japanese following as well. In 1900, according to one of his Japanese comrades who reported to Tokyo, Song's plans was to carve away 6 provinces on the south coast and found a republic, before gradually expanding to all 18 provinces of China, toppling the Isingyoros and finally establishing a Great East Asian Republic. In spite of his flirtation with Japan, the Japanese gave him only limited and intermittent support, and then he got nowhere. The Empress Dowager, exiled in Xi'an, remained the unshakable ruler of China, and she was adept at turning her plight to her advantage. She would sometimes burst into tears when she received her officials. A picture of vulnerability, she made the men feel protective and forgiving, happy to rise to the occasion and help a woman in need. But anyone stepping over a line will see a very different person. As County Chief Wu witnessed, as he had given her crucial service at her most difficult time, and she had never forgot a favor, he had been treated with intimacy, so much so that he felt bold enough to offer her some advice. One day he told her she could not have executed the officials before her flight, especially the former Prime Minister to Berlin, Jing Cheng, the man who, unbeknownst to the county chief, had given the Germans critical advice that he had done China untold harm. In the middle of a sentence, the Empress Dowager's face suddenly fell. Her eyes were like shooting daggers, and her jaw set tightly. The veins in her forehead bulged, and she gashed her teeth, hissing in the sternest voice. She told Wu that his criticism was unfair and born of ignorance of what had really happened. I had never seen the Empress Dowager in anger, and all of a sudden her wrath crashed down on me and scared the soul out of me. Wu felt sweat trickling down my back, and he kowtowed and apologized, and the Empress Dowager calmed down, and in an instant all her angry expressions vanished, and her face was relaxed and unclouded again. The shift was like the mightiest storm of thunder and lightning changing into a clear blue sky in a blink of an eye. The county chief remarked that he had not imagined that the Empress Dowager's wrath had such force. People said that great figures like Marquis Zheng and Li were so awed by the Empress Dowager that they lost their composure in their presence. I now believe it. Cixi had a gift of simultaneously inspiring protectiveness and fear, without hate. In exile and a less rigid environment, more people had access to Cixi and the Emperor. They never failed to be struck by the contrast between the two. The hardship of the long journey left her unmarked by any sign of fatigue or fragility, while her adopted son looked permanently on the verge of collapse. At audiences sitting side by side, the Emperor always kept his mouth shut no matter how long and awkward the silence, until Cixi turned to him. "Your Majesty, do ask some questions." Even then, he rarely asked more than 2 or 3. "Is everything alright outside? Is the harvest good?" County Chief Wu, who saw him many times, remembered that he only asked 2 identical questions. His voice was extremely tiny, like the buzz of a fly or a mosquito. You could hardly make out what he was saying. In contrast, Wu observed, the Empress Dowager talked most eloquently, quoting classical stories with ease, while at the same time being totally down to earth, familiar with the ways of people and society. She could read your mind after a few words, so the grandees were afraid of her. With an Empress Dowager so smart and strong, and the Emperor so old and weak, no wonder he was under her thumb. Eventually, the officials who noted down their audiences often simply referred to Cixi as Shang, the monarch, a designation usually reserved for the Emperor. Cixi herself was well aware of the shift of status. In Xi'an, for formal audiences, she had a throne set up for herself behind and above the Emperor's, thus presenting herself quite literally as superior to the Emperor. When they returned to Beijing, Cixi would sit on a centrally placed throne during an audience, while the Emperor Guangzhou was seated lower down on the dais to her left. The ordeal of the invasion, rather than damaging Cixi's authority, had enhanced it and brought her a new sense of security and confidence.